So our third snippet for this week looks at constitutional history during the Wilson administration, so 1913 through 1920. Wilson makes three nominations to the Supreme Court. One of them, Justice McReynolds, who was Wilson's first Attorney General, had a reputation as a progressive reformer, but turns out to be an extremely conservative justice. He's a racist. He's an anti-Semite. He's really not an appealing man. Wilson, of course, was a racist himself, so the fact that McReynolds was a racist was not problematic to Wilson. But nonetheless, this is an appointment for progressives, which is really a lost effort. You know, a progressive president in Wilson nominating someone who was going to be the most conservative member of the court by the early 1930s. But Wilson gets two other appointments to the court during the election year of 1916, when his only realistic path to victory is by winning ex-socialist voters who are up for grabs in the 1916 election, because the socialist nominee in 1912, Eugene Debs, is not running in 1916. One of them is Louis Brandeis, one of the most famous lawyers of the day, a consumer lawyer. The second, even more liberal than Brandeis, James Hesson Clark, who was an Ohio jurist. So Wilson's Supreme Court legacy is a complex one here. He brings McReynolds, this truly repulsive figure, to the court, but also appoints these liberals in Brandeis and Clark. The court as a whole, though, remains conservative during the Wilson years, because you still have majority of appointees from either the 1890s or the Roosevelt or the Taft years. Now, the issues that the court handles during this period, it's a reminder that progressivism, although the word progressive now has this left-wing connotation, progressivism in the early 20th century, it's a trickier approach. Progressives, for example, are perfectly willing to use the power of the state to suppress ideas that they don't like. And the backdrop to this is this law passed in 1873, the Comstock Act. It's an obscenity law, so it gives the power to the federal government to regulate obscene books or drugs, articles of an immoral nature. It's a very massive law. Obviously, there's some regulatory authority here. So let's say you have a situation where the federal government finds out that someone is selling, some company is selling a pill that they advertise as immediately curing cancer, and it turns out that the pill is actually just a tablet of aspirin. That's fraud, and the federal government can step in. But the Comstock Act's wording, and you can read it here, especially this section here in red, is very, very broad wording, which it conflicts with the First Amendment, but the court is reluctant to go there, in large part because even some progressive figures on the court are supportive of the idea that it's okay for the government to control certain kinds of speech. And the key decision here is a decision that will be written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was the dissenter in Lochner, quite progressive justice in many ways. But Holmes sees no problem with the idea of speech restriction. So, for instance, this 1907 decision that dealt with a Colorado law that restricted the ability of newspapers to cover trials on grounds that might influence the juries. And Holmes, again, that's we would think of this as an obvious First Amendment violation. Holmes says, it's basically okay. Our goal here is, the law is well intentioned, and that's enough for me. There is an effort. There's a greater interest in civil liberties during the progressive era. The ACLU was created during this period, and there's an effort to challenge the Comstock Act, which dates from the publication of this pamphlet of the Nudes and the Prudes, which is a nudist manifesto, deliberately designed to provoke. The author of the Nudes and the Prudes is arrested for violating the Sedition Act. He is sentenced to 2 months in jail. he knew this was likely to happen, and he sues. And the hope is the court will strike it down. Instead, in a decision called Fox versus Washington in 1915, the court says, no problem. We're not too worried that maybe, governors or local prosecutors will interpret this law too broadly and suppress, valuable speech. All you have here is sort of immoral smut, and if that can be suppressed. So this is an important element of progressive era jurisprudence. This idea that it is acceptable to use the power of the federal government to channel political discourse in certain ways and to exclude other ideas as beyond the pale. This is not a view of the First Amendment that I think would remain in place with most conservatives today, with most centrists, and at least with some liberals. The other issue during this period is that prohibition really starts to take off. It's initially a state-by-state union. This is a contemporary map from the 19-teens. The keys are down here. So the white states are states that have prohibited sale and dissemination of alcohol. The states with lines or checker charts have some limitations. And then if you look at the key, you'll note that 3 black states, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, are described in this map as booze states. These are the only states where alcohol is fully legal in the early 20th century. But you can get a sense from this map of how powerful the progressive, from the prohibitionist movement is, going from state to state. In 1913, the prohibitionists succeed in getting Congress to pass a law called the Webb-Kenyon Act, which outlaws the interstate distribution of alcohol. So the goal was here, let's say, you're in West Virginia and, you can't buy any beer or wine or, hard liquor in West Virginia, but maybe you could go to Pennsylvania and purchase the stuff and go back over to West Virginia. And Webb Kenyon says no, that, Pennsylvania alcohol can't be shipped into West Virginia. What finally puts the prohibition movement over the top is World War I, and for 2 separate reasons. The first is this sense that beer is a kind of German phenomenon. There's Budweiser and Pabst and Anheuser-Busch and all of these brewers, and so there's a kind of nativist reaction against beer. But secondly, there's a maternal reaction. The idea here is that you have these boys and young men who are going off to fight World War I. The first time in many instances they've been away from home, and the prohibitionists argue that they are vulnerable to the twin temptations of alcohol and prostitution, and therefore it's critical to abolish alcohol as a way of safeguarding the virtue of soldiers. This is a propaganda poster from World War I, which reflects this prohibitionist theme. And so the 18th Amendment of the Constitution will outlaw the sale and dissemination of alcohol. It will ultimately be repealed 15 years or so later. It turns out to be a disaster in approach. And then the last constitutional amendment from this period is women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment. So this is the state of affairs on the eve of suffrage. So you can see that women have a right to vote in almost every state. The only states that they don't are these mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania down to South Carolina and Alabama, although they have full suffrage only in the western states plus Michigan and New York. One thing you'll notice from this chart that a lot of places who didn't give women full right to vote gave them the right to vote on municipal issues or school issues. And again, the idea here is that women have a right as mothers to have a particular interest in education. The movement for women's suffrage is it's a class-based movement. Its leadership is primarily, college-educated women. If you look closely here, these are women protesters outside of the White House, and they're wearing across their coats the identity of the college or university that they attended. So you can see here, here's Oberlin, Here's Stanford. Here's the University of Missouri. So the idea that the suffrage movement was making is we are educated women. We are being denied the right to vote. This is inherently unfair. It's a very effective propaganda style. And it's a reminder in this period. I mean, when you know, I think too often when people teach the progressive era, they don't pay attention to the constitutional ramifications. But there are these four major constitutional amendments during this period. You know, the direct election of U.S. senators, the income tax amendment, prohibition, and the women's suffrage amendment. And the fact remains, after the passage of the suffrage amendment, we really don't see meaningful reform occurring through constitutional amendments anymore after that. Instead, the idea is to use the court and have the court make decisions on your behalf, or to rally politically. In the late stages, moreover, of the suffrage movement, the movement splits, and a more radical wing headed by this woman, Alice Paul, emerges. Paul is head of a group called the National Women's Party, the NWP, and she argues that voting is not enough, that the only way to have equal rights in society is through an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. She is the first major figure to push an ERA. It will be 50 years or so before Congress passes the ERA. As we know, the states ultimately do not approve of the ERA, so it remains a dead letter. So these are some of the themes from from this late 19th and early 20th century period. The Jim Crow era, the Insular cases, some limitations on the rights of non-whites in the American system, women becoming more powerful politically, and then these debates over the power of the Supreme Court in a variety of ways. So that's all we have for the snippets for this week. Hope everyone is safe and is staying well, and I will see you on Monday.